Good day, everyone. I am Genti de los Pobres. I'm taking the course Bachelor of Secondary Education, major in Mathematics. Continuity and gauge in section 5.5. 5.5.2 definition. So a gauge on I is a strictly positive function defined on I. So if a delta is a gauge on I, then a tag or partition P is said to be a delta fine F. So T sub I is an element of capital letter I sub I is a subset of closed interval T sub I minus delta of T sub I and T sub I plus delta T sub I for I is equal to 1 ellipses n. So we note that the notion of delta fineness requires that the partition be tagged, so we do not need to say tag partition. So in this case, a gauge delta on an interval I assigns an interval t minus delta of t and t plus delta of t. To each point, t is an element of I. So the delta fineness of a partition P requires that each subinterval capital letter I sub I of P is contained in the interval determined by a gauge delta and the tag T sub I for the subinterval. So this is indicated by the inclusions in number 1. So see figure 5.5.1. So note that the length of the subintervals is also controlled by the gauge and the tags. So the next lemma reflects that control. So in lemma 5.5.3, so if a partition P is of I is equal by definition of closed interval A and B, so is delta fine and X is an element of I, then there exists a tag T sub I. So in P such that absolute value of X minus T sub I less than or equal to delta of T sub I. So proof. So if X is an element of I, there exists a subinterval, close interval of X sub I minus 1 and X sub I from P that contains X. So since P is a delta fine, then T sub I minus delta of T sub I mm, less than or equal to X sub I minus 1 less than or equal to X less than or equal to X sub I less than or equal to T sub I plus delta of T sub I. So hence it follows that absolute value of X minus T sub I less than or equal to delta of T sub I. So 5.5.4 examples in letter A. So if delta and gamma are gauged on I equal by definition of closed interval A and B, and if 0 less than to delta of X and less than or equal to gamma of X. So for all X is an element of I. So then every partition P that is delta fine is also a gamma fine. So this follows immediately from the inequalities. So T sub I minus gamma of T sub I less than or equal to T sub I minus delta T of T sub I. And T sub I plus delta of T sub I less than or equal to T sub I plus gamma of T sub I. Which imply that T sub I is an element of closed interval T sub I minus delta of T sub I and T sub I plus delta of T sub I. is a subset of closed interval t sub I minus gamma of t sub I and t sub I plus the gamma of t sub I. So for all I is equal to 1, ellipses n. So in letter B, so if delta sub 1 and delta sub 2 are gauged on I, equal by definition of closed interval A and B, and if delta of x equal by definition of minimum subset of delta sub 1 of x and delta sub 2 of x. So for all x is an element of I. So then delta is also a gauge on I. Moreover, since delta of x less than or equal to delta sub 1 of x, then every delta find partition is delta sub 1 find. So similarly, every delta find partition is also delta sub 2 find. So in letter C, so suppose that delta is defined on I equal by definition of closed interval 0 and 1 by delta of x equal by definition of 1 all over 10 if x is equal to 0 and 1 all over 2x if x greater than to 0 but less than or equal to 1. Then delta is a gauge on the closed interval 0 and 1. So if 0 t is greater than 0 but less than or equal to 1, then closed interval t minus delta of t and t plus delta of t is equal to the closed interval 1 all over 2t and 3 all over 2t. So which does not contain the point 0. So, thus, if P is a delta find partition of I, then the only subinterval in P that contains 0 must have the point 0 as its tag. That's all. Thank you.